Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for joining this panel session on transformational climate action. I'm Nathan Subramaniam. I'll be the moderator for this session today. To introduce myself, I'm a director at the Independent Evaluations Department with the Asian Development Bank. My division oversees all the infrastructure sectors in the bank and also covers all of the private sector operations. We have a very interesting panel discussion today. We'll have two main parts to the panel discussion. We'll have a lead presentation and then follow it up with a panel discussion with three panelists with us. Let me give a little bit of a background and context to the discussion we have today. We all know the effects of climate change. It's getting increasingly severe by the day. The weather events are all getting much more severe. We are getting stronger hurricanes, more severe droughts, more wildfires. So addressing climate change is absolutely urgent and is very important for all of us. The recent IPCC report highlights that the greenhouse gas emissions are on an increasing trend, and the current ambitions to reduce them are not sufficient or not ambitious enough to meet the 1.5 degree climate targets before the end of the century. We all know Asia Pacific is a growing region in the world and is a big contributor to greenhouse gas emissions in the world. It contributes about half of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. And so without Asia Pacific getting involved, Paris targets are unlikely to be achieved. Even so, it's important to also note that not only is Asia Pacific a big emitter, but many of the countries and regions in Asia Pacific are also very vulnerable to climate impacts. So it is even more urgent for us to be focusing on this and addressing the climate effects. Now, in order to address climate, we have to have a very holistic, wholesome approach involving policy interventions, capacity, institution building, and we also need to have trillions of dollars of investments. We all know, due to the fiscal constraints, all of that money cannot come from the public side. Much of the money has to come from the private sector. So this has to be truly a unified public-private sector approach in order to deal with climate. And to be able to do that, it is very important to create the right enabling environment for private sector to come in and be able to participate and do all the things that they have to do. Now, in terms of addressing climate, there are two key areas, mitigation and adaptation. Both are very important, and there has been increased focus on the mitigation side. And so one of the things that has to happen over this decade is to redouble our focus on the adaptation side to ensure that for countries for which climate is an existential threat, we are providing the needed support, especially from all the MDBs on the adaptation side. Also important to note, in the post-COVID recovery, there are recent geopolitical issues that have come to bear, and we know how important resilience is. We all know the energy crisis that Europe and many other parts of the world are going through, and it is very important to ensure resilience is built in all our climate actions to make sure that the transition to cleaner fuels is smooth and can be sustained over a longer period of time. Thus, our actions to address climate change will have to be transformational in nature. It cannot be just about reducing energy usage and curtailing on emissions, because different countries are on different trajectories in terms of growth. And it's important to ensure that energy security is there for everybody, and that for countries that are on a brisk path towards growth will have the energy required for their growth in the future. Thus, our actions need to focus much more on the transformational climate action, and that is deep, systemic, and sustainable in shifting the economies towards low carbon and resilient pathways. So with that background, let me introduce the three esteemed panelists that we have today to join us in sharing with us their experience and expertise and share with us all their different approaches. First, we have Warren Evans from ADB, who's joining us. Warren has more than 41 years of experience in sustainable development and climate change. He was Environment Director at ADB and at the World Bank, and he's currently the Climate Czar at ADB. He is the Senior Advisor in the President's Office in charge of overseeing climate operations. He was also previously involved as the Special Project Facilitator in ADB, helping to improve the accountability mechanism. Welcome, Warren, and we look forward to your valuable insights. Our next panelist is Gita Batra. She is joining us from the Global Environment Facility. She is the Chief Evaluation Officer over there. Geeta brings over 28 years of experience in international development and evaluation, both in the private sector and much of it at the World Bank. Geeta worked for 10 years in the World Bank on private sector operations and close to 2 decades in evaluations with IFC advisory services, and more recently in conducting and managing evaluations focusing on environmental interventions at the GEF. Geeta also publishes evaluation findings in journals and World Bank Group publications. Welcome, Geeta. We are so glad to have you and look forward to hearing your insights. The third panelist who's joining us is Archi Rastogi. He's joining us from the Green Climate Fund. Archi has over 15 years of experience, and he's a PhD in natural sciences. Archi has a well-rounded experience ranging from grassroots NGO to media, academia, the UN, and management consulting. Currently, Archi is a senior research fellow at the Institute of Water Policy, Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, National University of Singapore. So with that introduction of the panelists, before I call on them to start the panel, I want to first introduce the evaluation that we have recently conducted. The Independent Evaluations Department last year did a seminal evaluation on climate change. And this was completed in October of last year, discussed with the board, and has been published soon after. This evaluation was led by Garrett Kilroy, who is joining us today. And he will do a lead presentation today to cover some of the key aspects that came out of that evaluation and discuss the evidence that came through specifically on transformational action. Before I hand it off to Garrett to discuss the key messages and evidence coming on transformational action, I just want to say a few words on the recommendations that came through from that evaluation. The key recommendation that came through was for ADB to better leverage its leadership role by addressing strategic and operational gaps, including the need for a bank-wide climate action plan, stronger country climate diagnostics, more attention on adaptation, and greater support for private sector engagement. Many of these recommendations are already currently under implementation, and I'm sure Warren will allude to this when he speaks. So with that background, hopefully you've all had a chance to participate in the polling question on defining transformational change. And with that, let me hand it off first to Garrett to do a quick presentation, 10-minute presentation on the recently concluded climate evaluation. And following that, I will open up the panel. Over to you, Garrett.
Well, thank you, Nathan. And so my name's Garrett, and I was the team leader for this evaluation, as Nathan said. And my job is to kind of set the scene so that we can get into discussion with the distinguished panelists that we have from the three institutions. This was an evaluation we completed just before COP26 last year. And today we'll present on some of the findings relevant to transformational change. I'd like to acknowledge my colleagues Nelson and Beth, who helped me with this presentation. So I'll briefly go through some of the definitions and the entry points for transformational change, and talk about some of the findings at the country level and also at the project level, an ex-ante assessment we did. And then also maybe share some of the examples of transformational investments that we found in the portfolio, and then some conclusions. So maybe I'll ask Beth to present the results of the poll just before I get into the definition. So that's quite interesting, 29% saying that, yes, I can define it. So congratulations to those of you. 14% have, I have no idea, and I'm not far behind you on that, but and then some, about the majority are, I have some idea, but I'm not sure. And I think, you know, that's one of the things about transformational change. It's quite elusive. One of the best definitions I came across was at the Ideas conference, the evaluation conference in Prague about 3 years ago, which was focused on transformational change. And I heard there one of the audience mentioned that I can't define it, but I know it when I see it. And I think it is one of those things that seeing is believing. And I think examples are very, very helpful. But definitions are very helpful also. And I present on the screen a couple of definitions from the institutions that have been working on this. There's one there from Jeff in their seminal evaluation in 2018. I'm sure Geeta will speak to that evaluation. There's the climate investment funds who've been working on transformational change through their learningship partnership for many years. And this is one of their more recent definitions, which has evolved over time. And then I also include our own definition, which we use for this evaluation. One of the common kind of themes coming through these different definitions is that they're looking for systemic, deep systemic change. That's one kind of common themes that comes out. Also looking for large scale impact. And this is where country context is quite important. Something that could be large scale in one country, maybe not so large scale in another. And then the other characteristic that jumps out is sustainability. We want these transformational investments to be sustainable during their lifetime and beyond. But having a definition is the starting point. What are our entry points to developing a transformational portfolio? When we looked at this, we kind of saw that, you know, in our theory of change for this evaluation, transformational change with our developing member countries was pitched at a very high level, at the impact level. But we realized that actually there's quite a few things that need to happen before we get to a transformational portfolio. So this slide is just showing kind of the pathway towards a transformational portfolio. It starts with the strategy and policies that institutions have. So this is how an institution like ADB and others communicates to its developing member countries and to its own staff, its own members, on what its priorities are for climate and how it hopes to affect change for climate action. And I think a good example here is ADB's updated energy policy, which has a very clear emphasis on supporting our developing member countries to transition towards a low carbon economy. Institutional setup is also important in terms of having the staff with the right skill set to deliver transformational change, and mainstreaming of our processes and our systems in our developing our portfolio is also important. The second kind of entry point, which is probably the most important, is country engagement. This is, you know, like most of our organizations, we have country partnership strategies with our developing member countries. And this is our opportunity to make a case for transformational change with our clients, with our governments that we work with. But one of the findings of our evaluation is that to get there, to make that case, you need to underpin the strategies with robust country climate diagnostics. And then we finally get to the portfolio. And this, you know, ADB has a range of modalities that it can be deployed, different instruments, different facilities and funds that are available to support transformational investments. And also, I mentioned technical assistance, which I'll talk about in a couple of slides, which is also quite important in the sequencing of such investments. So at the country level, this is some analysis we did where we looked at, for 27 of our developing member countries, We looked at their country partnership strategies over our evaluation period, and we split them into two cohorts, sort of older country strategies and newer ones. And what we found when we looked at the results frameworks, we looked at the strategic focus, we saw that there was an uptick after the 2015 Paris Agreement, with a stronger focus where climate was a strategic pillar of these country strategies, compared to before when it was maybe a cross-cutting issue. And we also saw this reflected in the results frameworks of the country strategies. And more recent CPSs have paid greater attention to supporting national determined contributions and governments' long-term strategies for their climate action. Now, of course, there's clearly scope for a wider approach across our member countries and greater tailoring, and that's where I think the country climate diagnostics are really important. And another gap that we identified was the private sector role, which needs to be more clearly articulated in our country strategies. Now, at the project level, one bit of analysis we did was to carry out an ex-ante assessment of transformational potential of our portfolio. So we took a random sample of about 250 investments, which represented about a third of the portfolio overall. And again, we split it into an older cohort and a newer cohort to see if we could track any kind of change over time. And using our definition, which I outlined at the beginning, we identified about 9% of the projects were transformational in the older cohort, and there was an uptick to about 14% in the newer cohort. And one of the things we identified was that our policy-based lending, which are what we call our program loans, were driving much of that increase, which kind of makes sense, and that those policy-based lending tends to operate at a higher level, a more systemic level than standard projects. Is 14% enough? Probably not, but by the same token, not everything could be transformational. But we probably, we need more in our region based on some of the challenges that Nathan outlined at the outset. Just the same set of transformational projects, when we look at the sector breakdown, maybe not surprisingly, energy jumps out as one of the big sectors where a lot of our emphasis, our strategies and our focus has been on supporting that transition to low carbon economies. But it was also interesting that some non-core infrastructure sectors stood out in this group, particularly finance and public sector management, which also tend to operate at slightly higher level than a standard project. Examples. Now, seeing is believing, and these are just some examples I've taken from each of our 5 regions that ADB works in. And I'll mention just one point on each of them. The Uzbekistan, a very carbon intense economy, the power sector reform program, a policy-based loan, was instrumental in improving the enabling environment for renewables and improving the power mix in that country. And soon after this project, there were private sector investments for solar and more recently for wind. The example in China is the Zhangtang Low Carbon Transformation Program, which was interesting in that it combined a project loan and a policy-based loan. And the PBL was seen as need to establish the norms for low carbon business. The Bangladesh project is also interesting. The Coastal Climate Resilience Infrastructure Project is quite an old project, approved in 2012. But what was interesting about it is, even though it was quite old, it had a very comprehensive climate risk assessment in its design, a full 3 years before ADB had mainstream climate risk assessment in it as part of its framework. And then similarly in the Philippines, the Tui Macban geothermal green bond, ADB's first climate bond, and demonstrative of the catalytic effect that our private sector operations can have in this space. And then finally, the example for the Pacific is the Pacific Disaster Resilience Program, which supports several of our Pacific member countries in their disaster risk management. So priority actions for supporting DRM, but also allowing access to contingent disaster financing, which was most recently demonstrated in the case of Tonga during the volcano disaster there. So these are just some examples that we picked out just to give you a flavor. One couple of points on technical assistance before I forget and before I finish. TA tends to get neglected or forgotten because some of the other investments are quite large, in the tens and the hundreds of millions and sometimes in the billion. But TA is critical to help foster that government buy-in and partnership development and knowledge work. And when TA operates at that policy and planning level, you can get that disproportionate transformational impact where you have the knock-on effect to the government's wider planning approach. And then finally, often TA is really important in sequencing towards a transformational project. We saw in a number of cases that a lot more upfront effort is needed to set up a project for that is truly transformational. And that's when TA makes a real impact in that sequencing. And then finally, just some conclusions before we hand back to the panel. I think all of our institutions, are looking towards having a portfolio that is transformational in terms of its ambition, but it needs to be underpinned by robust corporate and country strategies to get that engagement and buy-in at the country and client level. These investments do require additional effort and resources, and the sequencing of things like technical assistance is really important in that regard. And then finally, from an evaluation perspective, we need to raise our game in terms of trying to track and measure transformational change so that we can advocate for replication and scale up of these kind of examples. So I'm going to stop there and hand back to Nathan. Thank you for listening. I look forward to a really interesting panel discussion.
Thank you, Garrett. Wonderful presentation. Now, over to the panel. I'm going to get the panel started now. We'll have 3 rounds of panel questions. And then following the 3rd round, we'll open it up for Q&A with the audience. Please enter your questions in the chat box, and then we'll have them prioritized, and then we'll direct it appropriately to each of the panelists. For the round 1, I'm going to give 8 minutes to each of the panelists, and we'll have the same set of questions to the 3 different institutions so that the audience can hear perspectives and insights from each of these institutions. The 2 questions that we're going to ask of the panelists are, the first question is, in the context of your organization's work, what are the challenges and constraints you see in tackling climate change? That's the first question. The second question is, what are your institution's priorities for climate action? And how important is transformational change for your institution support? So these are the 2 questions, common questions that we're going to ask of all 3 panelists. Let me first start with Geeta. Over to you. From your institution's perspective, the Jeff's perspective.
Thank you, Nathan. Thank you, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. Since Nathan mentioned about challenges, I think, and Garrett pointed out to the need for better evaluation, I'm going to focus on what we've done in terms of addressing a few challenges in evaluating for transformational change. Just giving you a little idea of our recent evaluation, as well as a broad focus towards and a shift towards systems thinking, which we think is imperative for evaluating transformational change. The current COVID-19 has clearly demonstrated the nexus between human and environmental systems, and that the road to recovery, as Garrett pointed out, country focus will be really important. And within that, I think the focus on linking environmental as well as human systems. The SDGs have also pointed out to the link between environment as well as socio and economic objectives. So it's imperative that programs and evaluations will need to address multiple challenges. The ecological crisis, as Nathan pointed out, it's not just the climate crisis, it's also other environmental crises in biodiversity, in pollutants, etc. Of course, the health angle through COVID-19, as well as institutions and markets. Garrett mentioned the definition we've used at the Independent Evaluation Office of the GEF, transformational change being deep, systemic, sustainable change with large-scale impact in an area of global environmental concern. We have taken this from Adapted IEG, the World Bank's evaluation department. Now, what does this mean? It requires interlinking different thematic areas that the GEF has come traditionally worked in: international waters, chemicals and waste, land degradation, and climate change. We've seen the links between all these different focal areas and climate change. So it's not about just addressing climate change, but it's also about addressing other environmental areas, and these are all interlinked. So all evaluation will have to actually consider these linkages, in addition to the linkages with social and economic objectives as well. GEF has, in its recent programming, and we've just finished the 7th replenishment of the GEF, there's a big focus actually on the path towards integration, as well as broader impact programs to address the main drivers of environmental degradation. And this is a challenge for evaluation. So what does that require in addressing this challenge? One needs to take a more systems approach, or a lens, where you're not looking at the intervention in isolation. Yes, we're all doing objectives-based evaluation, where we are assessing the project for what it has sought out to achieve. But projects also need to take a more systems view towards designing their interventions. So you can't really evaluate a project in isolation. You've got to define system boundaries for the interventions. So this requires a shift in thinking for evaluation. You can't use a linear theory of change anymore. You know, the traditional theory of change where you say it's an input leading to outputs, leading to outcomes, and then impacts. You've got to use a broader theory of change where you take all these various interactions into consideration. You've got to use both quantitative as well as qualitative methods, and environmental evaluation in one way actually lends itself to a lot of geospatial analysis. And to do a systems approach, or take a systems approach, requires actually knowing where these projects are located, and the geography and the topography around these, to understand the nature of environmental interventions that would work, as well as the boundaries within which these operate. You've got to, like any other evaluation, of course, look at synergies and trade-offs, but here it's synergies and trade-offs across the various environmental domains, as well as between environment and socioeconomic trade-offs. So it's slightly different from some of our traditional evaluations. And finally, I think we've got to all start looking at additionality, as well as whether the project sought to be transformative. Because part of the role of evaluation is actually to guide projects at the very outset on whether they have the elements in place to be transformative. It's not just about going at the ex post end and saying, was this project transformative, if we didn't plan for transformational change? So the theory of change needs to represent the actual world, the real world, and the linkages. Transformational change needs to take into account a variety of factors: internal, external, contextual conditions, as Garrett pointed out, and as well as the opportunities for longer term stability. And definitely a focus on ambition for change. We found that if there's no ambition, transformational change is not going to happen. This is just an example of a transformative multifocal area program in India, since we are in the region. This was a participatory approach that had environmental objectives as well as socioeconomic objectives, and achieved the two. I will provide the link to the evaluation at the end. So the lessons were for us from our evaluation that you need clear ambition in design. You've got to address market and system changes through policies. We've got to focus a lot on policy design and policy interventions. You have to have mechanisms for financial as well as other forms of stability. And we found innovation to play quite an important role in leading to transformational change as well as higher value added. So what's the implication for evaluation? It's worth repeating this, taking a holistic view. And we're trying to do this in every evaluation now. We're trying to apply a systems view and a systems thinking approach, taking context into consideration, particularly in fragile and conflict affected states. This becomes really important. looking at all the factors and drivers of transformational change, the integration between environment and social systems. In the past, environmentalists only looked at environment, and typical development practitioners would only look at development and poverty. The SDGs furthered that thinking, and I think it's really time, even with COVID now, to recognize this link is really important. And we're trying to do this using data, not only geospatial information, but also survey data from the ADB, the World Bank, et cetera, on the LSMS, the health surveys, linking environment and socioeconomic data together. And of course, quantitative and qualitative approaches are important. We've just released a book, and this is actually a compendium of new authors and their views on transformational change for people and the planet. It's freely downloadable. You don't have to purchase it. It's on open access. And another place where Garrett referred to this is our evaluation on Jeff's support for transformational change. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much and look forward to the next round.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Geeta. Now over to Warren, to you, the same two questions from an ADB perspective.
Thanks very much. And it's a pleasure to be here this afternoon. This is a really important event, both because of the subject matter, but also the timing. So I'm going to focus particularly, I'm not going to talk much about the IED review. I should say that I had the pleasure of being the environment director during the independent evaluation of the World Bank's first independent evaluation of the World Bank's climate change work. And it was a painful process, which, we all know that can happen. But I'll tell you, it's similar to this one. It really leads to a rethinking, a recalibration, and a recommitment on the part of management to the issue. And I think that's what happened here. In fact, after the IED review that Nathan talked about and Garrett talked about, our president, Masa, after a number of discussions and quite a bit of analytical work, increased our climate ambition from $80 billion from 2019 to 2030 to $100 billion for that same time period. So a $20 billion increase. The bulk of this is focused on adaptation and private sector finance. So very, very consistent with what the independent evaluation recommended. At the same, and in parallel right now, we're working on a climate change action plan, and it will focus at the end of the day on all of the issues that IED raised, and transformation. And I'll come back to that in a minute. So let me talk about what I consider the greatest challenges for our DMCs, but also ADB. I don't see a difference here. I think that the challenges our developing member countries have, those are our challenges. We have to adopt those as our challenges. For me, on climate change, the greatest challenge is scaling up support to improve resilience of vulnerable communities and infrastructure across the region. There's always, every region claims it's the most vulnerable, but I think at the end of the day, if you look at vulnerable populations and countries, Asia and Pacific is probably the most vulnerable to impacts of climate change. They're happening now, as Nathan mentioned. The concurrent flooding in Pakistan and the extreme drought that is drying up the Yangtze River in China are good examples of this. These devastating events are just going to increase in terms of intensity and frequency in the years to come. The donor community has to do everything it can to help build the resilience of these vulnerable communities and countries to these increasing climate change threats. Climate resilient infrastructure development requires an understanding of what the risks are from climate impacts and a rethinking of how such infrastructure, whether small or large, is designed. After all, why would you invest in infrastructure that has a high risk of failure due to increasing risks of climate impacts? So we need to really mainstream climate adaptation and resilience measures across all possible sectors. And I'm really glad that Gcip and GEF are here with us, because the importance of access to climate finance from your institutions to co-finance efforts that we have, and often to lend a level of concessionality, particularly in the poorest countries, is absolutely critical for scaling up investments, particularly in adaptation. The second challenge, I think, is to help our DMCs to undertake the essential policy, governance, and institutional reforms required to empower communities and the private sector to act on climate risks and opportunities. Garrett mentioned, and I think Nathan mentioned, the role of policy-based lending for helping countries. This requires a considerable effort at upstream analytical work, understanding the policy framework, understanding the governance issues, the institutional constraints, and then putting together a program of assistance that helps a country to actually, and I consider this transformation at the country level, to transform their policy base so that it is conducive to investments by the private sector and effective investments by the public sector in both mitigation and adaptation. And part of this, that an area that ADB is working on very closely, is really the just transition part of the mitigation, the decarbonization issue. So this is a new area for all of us. We're working on this to try and figure it out, but it really is linked to the policy base of the countries that are undergoing or will undergo large decarbonization programs. How do you deal with the communities, the households that are deeply affected by this shift from fossil fuel-based economy to low carbon economies? The third challenge I would look at is mobilizing climate finance. There is a lot of focus on climate finance accounting and making sure that the MDBs really are driven by outcomes rather than financial objectives. But I think that for the foreseeable future, the big ticket item will be how to mobilize more climate finance. For doing this, financial innovation is critical. And in this area, we're doing a lot of work on the private sector. We'll talk about this a little bit later, but we also need to stimulate and increase public sector finance, whether it's domestic resource mobilization or within institutions like ADB, because of our AAA credit rating and our partnerships with countries. We think we're in a good position to undertake new innovative initiatives. One of them is the Innovative Finance Facility for Climate in Asia and Pacific, the IFCAP. This will use a guarantee facility, a guarantee mechanism to take $1 in and generate $4 in climate finance. And at the end of the day, we're looking at probably starting with a pilot of $2.5 billion guarantee to free up about $9 billion of additional climate finance. And that'll generate somewhere around $16 to $24 billion in climate investments. This is important because the current sources of climate finance, the GCF, the SIFs, and the GEF, are generally not specifically or explicitly, but generally it's $1 in, $1 out. And so we're trying to come up with something that gets $1 in, $4 out. And this is work in progress. We hope to launch it at next year's ADB annual meeting. The fourth challenge I would say is on decarbonization and low carbon development. And the only thing I'll say here is that it's all about scale and speed. We need to accelerate and we need to go to scale on this. I think this is easier than the adaptation agenda, but it's a huge challenge and we're not going to get there the way we're going right now. The energy transition mechanism, maybe we can discuss that later, but it's a major initiative in Indonesia, Philippines, potentially Vietnam, potentially India, to decarbonize, to basically close down coal-fired power plants early. And then the fifth challenge and the last challenge is really, this is an ADB issue. How do we develop the internal capacity to deliver the kind of support that our DMCs need, both in public and private sector? How do we mobilize our resources? How do we get the internal training that's required so that every sector specialist in ADB becomes a sector climate change specialist? Every economist, every country economist becomes a country economist / climate change economist. That is a big challenge for us. We're undertaking a very large scale training program now to upskill our own staff, and we're bringing on board a lot of new people. It's something that doesn't happen overnight, but it is underway. It's work underway. And we think that the reorganization that's also underway will help us to actually deploy those skills more effectively in the coming years in our DMCs. Last thing I'll mention, Nathan, is back on transformational change. I also would have had a hard time defining it. I think the definitions you put up were good, but I think that looking at what delivering transformational change means is that we need to go into the next orbit when it comes to supporting climate actions in developing member countries. We need the PBLs, and then we need to look very holistically across the whole economy at the country level. We need to be taking 10-year or 15-year time slices and securing the kind of partnerships and financing required to actually move from where we are today to where they want to be 15 years from now. We can't do this with individual projects that may or may not be transformational in and of themselves, but for us to be transformational at the country level means we've got to take on this challenge at the country level over a longer term time period and across all sectors. I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Excellent, Warren. Thank you so much. And rightly put, I think transformational has to be something in a new orbit. It has to be a new paradigm, and it has to be a new technology. I think that is the only way the size of the pie itself can be made bigger, and we can go into cleaner sources of fuel and new way of looking at this whole thing. So we can all maintain our lifestyles and continue to grow, but go into this way of doing it all in a cleaner fashion. Over to you, Archi. The same two questions, but from a GCF point of view.
Thank you, Nathan. Good morning. Greetings, colleagues from Songo, Korea. And I'm speaking from the perspective of Green Climate Fund, which is the newest of all of the organizations that we have on the panel. So GCF has the advantage that the paradigm shift or transformational change or paradigm shift are actually part of the very mandate of the GCF. So if you look at the mandate of the GCF in 2 lines, transformational change or paradigm shift is right there. So there we have the advantage of actually being designed for a paradigm shift. The mandate of the GCF is also quite unique in the sense that it provides for direct access. So entities at the national or the regional level should be able to access GCF, whereby the assumption is building capacities. There's an emphasis on private sector. There's an emphasis on vulnerable countries, particularly small islands, least developed countries in Africa. There is an emphasis also on country ownership, that countries should be able to design projects and sort of have ownership of those projects and programs. And there is in the core of the GCF also a provision for balance between adaptation and mitigation. So Nathan's question relates to how climate is addressed, but climate and paradigm shift are both very part of the DNA. So I'll just speak on behalf of drawing experiences from evaluations that we've done recently. And we've done several evaluations, although the institution is quite new. We've done different evaluations which look at processes, which look at portfolios, the SIDs and LDCs, but also performance reviews. We finished a first performance review a couple of years ago, and now we're doing the second performance review, which informs some of the findings that I'll bring to this panel today. So in the GCF, in the current stage of GCF, a lot has been done. An incredible institution has been built with a mandate that's never been delivered before. This is public finance at scale to address a very a shifting problem or a wicked problem, as some academics might like to call it. And the institution is also one characteristic is also parity in the board, the GCF, where developing countries and developed countries have equal representation and voting rights. There's a $10 billion portfolio built in a very short amount of time. Virtually every developing country is eligible to receive GCF finance. More than 140 have accessed readiness finance, and more than 120 have accessed project level finance. There's a lot of legitimacy, scale, and the mandate is quite unique. So all of that is working quite well. Some of the learnings that we want to that are quite interesting are three. So one relates to the operational processes. Now, GCF has been perceived quite from the beginning as a relatively hard institution to access. So accreditation to the GCF. So GCF operates through a accreditation model in which entities become accredited. AEW, for instance, is an accredited entity of the GCF. So accreditation or access to FPs is quite challenging relative to Jeff even. And this has challenges for the reputation of the institution, but also the urgency. So Warren was speaking, for instance, of urgency as well. Garrett was as well. And this is quite central to thinking about transformations as well. It's also possible that in the design of the institution, because the mandate is so wide-reaching, that the processes themselves are not very clear what their eventual design is for. So, for instance, if we consider accreditation itself, what its ultimate purpose is intended to be, is not quite clear. And therefore, because every process tends to respond to every kind of mandate, we find a bit of an overload. And that leads to some of the delays. And that leads me to my second point about strategic ambiguity. So in the GCF, as in many other institutions, there is some amount of strategic priority going on, right? The pipeline for all of our institutions is far larger than the portfolios of the institutions. So whether it's at the sectoral level, whether it's the country level, regional level, or instruments, there is some amount of prioritization, but the criteria for that prioritization is not quite clear or evident to many of us. We're asking more and more that strategy or that criteria should become more clear, and that will give the institution its character. And by character, this is what I mean. When we look at the country case studies that have informed several of our evaluations, we find that GCF projects themselves are in fact contributing to a paradigm shift, but at the subsectoral level or in a minor way. In some cases, they bring about scale. In other cases, they advance the finance that would have come from other resources or, let's say, a public sector entity, but they advance that timeline. While we're just speaking about scale and timing, and those are probably those two things that they respond to. But at a subsector level, GCF projects by and large remain aligned with some national priorities, but are not necessarily supporting the most urgent priorities of countries. And that we're asking can change. It's perceived as a bit of a distant partner, passive sort of provider of finance. It's not yet seen as a convening partner, as a strategic partner, as a partner that helps define countries what their planning should be with regard to climate. And that we're asking can change, because that's the need also, a gap also in climate finance in many countries. Geeta was speaking about the scope of the problem of environmental challenges and the challenge of thinking about them holistically. Even if we're thinking about climate alone, it's still super large and it's still quite hard to pin it down and specifically address it. So that's the second point, to become more clear in strategy and proactive, but also intention within the organization, so that the paradigm shift and the transformation is not just at the project level, but at the institutional level and the portfolio level, because that is yet to emerge. The third point I'll make very quickly is about risks. So a lot of GCF projects are actually not yet, very little of the GCF project is under implementation, very little information is available from the portfolio that's under implementation. So we only have 15 midterm evaluations available for a very large portfolio, and that's very limited information. But what's becoming quite clear is that risks are not always accounted for. So in the design of an institution to address climate change and to provide a paradigm shift, as there was a rush initially to get portfolio under implementation, maybe there was insufficient attention paid to risks at the project level. And that contributes also to project delays. And that keeps a paradigm shift from happening. So we're asking also for the risk management frameworks to become strengthened and to account for risks, especially infrastructure projects, within the very design and the core of these projects, and to address those risks right from the beginning. So those were the three key points, but some of the gaps that remain are also, for instance, just transition. So in the GCF, currently that is quite nascent, that understanding of just transitions or that support of just transitions. Loss and damage. Should the GCF do more? Should it do less? And the CCC hasn't yet quite determined what the mandate should be there. And data is yet limited. So in the GCF, all of this understanding is based on very preliminary data coming from projects. We don't have the history of a Jeff or the scale of an ADB. These are very, very few projects that have begun to provide some information, and the institution is still under sort of construction and revision. So so that remains another challenge from an evaluation, but also a learning perspective, of which we'll speak in a minute. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Archie. Very, very interesting, very insightful. Now let's go to the second round. I think we are running a little bit behind on time. So if you all can be very brief in your responses, maybe limited to 3 or 4 minutes and, to your responses as part of the second round question. The second round, we're going to focus on knowledge and evidence gaps in order to promote transformational climate action. And for this round, I'm going to first start with Warren. The reason is ADB is an infrastructure bank, much more focused on the investment side. Whereas the other 2 panelists here, you guys have a partnership role to play with the other MDBs that are much more focused on investments in helping to close the gap in terms of knowledge and evidence. So let's first hear from Warren, right, in terms of how is ADB, Warren, you talked so eloquently about all the different investments ADB is doing, billions of dollars out the door every year. But obviously, you know, there are so many challenges that you're facing to meet the climate targets, which are very complex and becoming increasingly complex. And not enough knowledge and evidence is available to be able to design good projects and to be very effective. How are you overcoming that challenge? And more specifically, what are some of the partners like Gcip and GEF do to help bridge that knowledge and evidence gap? Over to you, Warren.
Thanks. I'll be quick. I think there are 3 key approaches that we need to take to bridge the knowledge and evidence gaps, and I think we're doing this, but again, not quickly enough and not at the right scale. First are country and sector analyses. If we're going to go to a whole economy approach in dealing with climate challenges and opportunities, we've got to understand the issues across the board in the country. We can't just look at a single sector. And there's a lot of work being done now. You know, part of it's linked to the NDCs and the NAPs, but really for example, the work the World Bank's doing right now on country analyses is critically important. So we need to have a really good understanding. And this is, for us, this is critical if we're going to undertake a policy-based loan, or scale up within any sector, scale up our assistance, or cross sectors, scale up our assistance to countries and investments. The second is at the investment project level. So we really need, we've been working, I think, doing pretty well improving our understanding of climate risks when we're looking at investment projects, and done a pretty good job of understanding how to climate proof, and this is, you know, this is important. It was step number 1, but the step number 2 now is going back to my first challenge, which is on the climate resilience area, is how do we, at the investment project level, how do we really impact the local communities, the local government, the national government, in terms of building resilience? How do we refocus project level interventions to make sure we're optimizing the resilience of those who are intended as beneficiaries? That requires a different kind of analysis. And then third and finally would be at the regional and global level. The kinds of partnerships that we have now in the water sector and in virtually every sector are critically important to work together with think tanks, research institutions, other MDBs, climate finance institutions like like the Gcip or the SIFs. We've been working with the Jeff on knowledge products for years and years and years. Those partnerships are absolutely critical to bring the best talent to the table to understand the issues at the local, national, and global levels. And so I think all of that is being done. We just have to figure out how to do it faster, bigger, and better. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Warren. Wonderful, wonderful. I think that sets the stage now for GCF and Jeff, right? Geeta, let me come to you, right? Jeff is prioritizing addressing pressing environmental issues. You heard Warren speak about the challenges that he's encountering, doing investments at the project level, right? And how do you extend check for resilience at the community level, and how can you make sure that that's sustained? Obviously, that involves some of the things that you were talking about, the systems level and being able to look at it at the systems level, the interactions there, and how to measure it and how to make sure progress is being made. So from where you guys see more broadly the knowledge and evidence gaps for transformational climate action, but also anything that you can add to what Warren has said.
Thanks, Nathan. I think the science on integration seems to have furthered quite a bit in terms of its thinking on, the links between environment and other areas, as well as across environmental areas. But I think the evidence is still, needs to be generated on that. And that's something we're working on to show whether these broader impact programs that address drivers, whether it's in food security, sustainable cities, circular economy, et cetera. So the onus is on us to actually generate the evidence from the ground. Now, the Jeff has had the benefit of over 25 years. So we are sitting on a good gold mine of data to draw on evidence on different types of interventions. One area, though, I think, and you alluded to this earlier, Nathan, is about the private sector. And I think here is an area where Jeff needs to do more work. We've done some private sector assessments, which really show an incomplete understanding of both sides and how the private sector could actually play a role in addressing environmental degradation. And Jeff played a role earlier with IFC in generating the blended finance instrument, but there's more out there in terms of biodiversity, chemicals. It's not just about climate, right? So that's an area we definitely have to do more work in and try to understand how non-grant instruments could actually play a role here. And Jeff has started doing some work with the World Bank on non-grant instruments. The other area is on nature-based solutions. And I recently was privy to a new project that the ADB is launching in India, in the city of Chennai. And it was really impressive to see how the planning is being structured around developing cities and expanding cities with keeping nature-based solutions in mind. Now this is fairly new and recent, and it's really interesting that they're finally looking at this as a view to building resilience and as well as addressing local adaptation issues in light of the climate crisis they've been facing. Understanding scaling up the processes, we've tried and attempted this, but there's a lot more to understand. How do you actually scale up innovative interventions? The Jeff does have a fund separately for adaptation. It's the LDCF and the Special Climate Change Fund. And I think there we're trying to test out, different innovations like on early warning systems that work, et cetera. And we've got to generate the evidence on what works there. So there's a lot of work for us to do. And above all, I think it is, how do you contribute from an evaluator's perspective to improve design up front so that people are taking all this into account, planning for transformational change, building for resilience ex ante, and not just at the evaluation ex post point. I'll stop there. Thank you.
No, excellent, Geeta. I think that closes the loop a little bit, right? Because you rightly point out, finding the issues and the evidence is one thing, but then properly collating it and making it available and useful for design is a completely different task. And I think this is fantastic what you have referred to, and I think maybe more work needs to be done so as to be able to combine and have it as an accessible information source where we can pull all the data together from all the different sources. Now over to Archi, to you. Green Climate Fund is the largest climate fund and has a huge role to play in making sure Paris happens, right? The Paris alignment happens. So, how are you guys facilitating the provision of evidence and knowledge gaps for effective implementation of Paris and other climate interventions?
Yeah, thanks, Nathan. I think the problem in the GCF is actually the opposite of the problem that Geeta highlighted. Whereas Geeta has the luxury of a large history of interventions and large body of evidence, here the problem is to design for that evidence so that we don't find ourselves at a point where that evidence is absent. A lot of action has happened, but the evidence is not there. So I'll just make 2 quick points. One we're finding from what we've seen in the projects that there is still a tension because the mandate of the GCF is quite wide. There is a tension between 2 different kinds of mandates: the capacity related dimensions on the one hand and urgency on the other. So if you program for capacity building, then you are less able to address urgent climate issues, or scale on the one hand, so with direct access on the other. So country level entities are able to implement projects of less magnitude than, let's say, a World Bank project or a AEW, what an AEW can implement. So that clearly becoming evident, but that's becoming evident through evaluations of portfolios. What still remains absent in the GCF is, or it still remains to be designed properly, is the collection of evidence or a knowledge management system. GCF is in the DNA, it's written that GCF would be a learning institution. And we've seen some action of it, but we've not seen the implementation of the results come in so far. There is a knowledge management strategy, there is a results management framework, but the implementation is relatively soft so far, and we've not seen valuable insights emerge from that. At the evaluation level, we do continue to do evaluations of portfolios, and evidence reviews and collect evidence from what we know from the experience of institutions such as the JEF and ADB and others, and to bring that into GCF. But again, the knowledge we generally see is quite advanced or available, generally speaking, for mitigation-related sectors or energy or infrastructure, but much less for adaptation, and that perhaps relates to the complexity of some of those interventions as well. For the sake of time, I'll just stop here and happy to comment.
Thank you, Archie. Really good point there, right? Is how do you prioritize capacity building versus addressing pressing climate issues? I think it's an interesting point that you bring up there. So, let me now go to the next round, the third round. The third round of questions are going to focus on the private sector, right? So we're going to talk about the role of private sector in driving transformational change. And I will start the question first here again to Warren. Right, ADB, Warren, under the earlier strategy 2020, wanted to increase the share of private sector operations. It had an ambitious target, and it did all it can to come close to achieving the target. And then now in strategy 2030, which was recently instituted, again, there is ambitions to increase private sector operations in the bank and to match the needs on the ground here with many DMCs, which are pretty dynamic and are increasingly requiring support on the private sector side and on the knowledge side. Given that this is a growing area in the bank, Warren, can you talk to how the private sector can get engaged in addressing climate change and how can it be transformational?
Sure, thanks. So I think first off, there's a tendency, particularly for some reason when we talk about climate finance, to pretend that public sector and private sector somehow work independently of each other. And when it comes to mobilizing finance, I would argue that the idea of just pure private sector infrastructure financing, for example, those models won't work if we're looking to scale up low carbon, climate resilient infrastructure development. We've got to use the public sector more effectively. We already talked about the kinds of policy reforms required and so on to enable the private sector to engage, but also we need to use our public sector money as a part of an investment. So blended finance for mobilizing private sector, private finances is absolutely essential. So I think that we're in the process of moving into a new era of blended finance, and again, the importance of concessional money finance from institutions like our colleagues from JEF and the GCF is absolutely crucial for making that happen more quickly and at scale. We need to be playing a more proactive role, I think, in ADB in both mobilizing private finance as well as domestic resources. So it's not an either or. We need a much higher level of domestic resource mobilization for the kinds of investments that we're talking about. So within ADB, the private sector operations department has stepped up. They recognize the critical need for financial innovation, and they have established a climate finance team that whose job is purely to help set the stage for identifying mitigation and adaptation opportunities for private sector investments. I think the more important and equally important initiative is some of the what I find some of the most interesting innovative financing approaches that are being taken now. And I'm going to go back, and I'm actually on a panel with the CEO of the GEF tomorrow at the BirdLife International 100-year celebration, where we're going to talk about funding nature. And the GEF has recently, with the World Bank, issued a rhino bond. I just find this fantastic. And this is what we need to be thinking about. We need to be thinking about targeted climate bonds that can mobilize large funding for investments in climate resilience and mitigation. We've done a lot of green bonds and blue bonds. We need to build on that experience and really build up a climate bond portfolio, and in part stealing a little bit of the idea from the GEF initiative on the rhino bond, particularly in areas where we're looking at nature-based adaptation, for example. Those are perfect for this kind of targeted intervention. We have the Asean Catalytic Green Finance Facility, I think, which is very innovative in mobilizing it's going to provide about $1.4 billion in funding for climate. The energy transition mechanism I talked about earlier is a very innovative initiative to basically shut down a number of coal-fired power plants early and to replace those with renewable energy and ensure a just transition while we're doing that. So I think these are all examples. There are many, many examples in ADB of innovative climate finance, or in innovative bond issues that are related to climate finance, I should say. But I think we need to focus now on how do we really build on that experience and borrow from others like the GEF to take this into a new area of innovation. Thanks.
Yeah, excellent. Warren, well said. I think, borrowing special ideas from others and focusing on mobilization, as you rightly pointed out, because after all, given the size of all these economies, we are still a drop in the bucket. And so how can we, mitigate some of the risks that the market is not able to mitigate? And how can we use that as a tool to mobilize large amounts of capital, billions to trillions, to address climate is well said. I think it's an important objective for us. Now over to you, to Geeta. I think, Geeta, you pointed earlier to the importance of enabling environment, right, for private sector, and ensuring that is done, and also having proper diagnostics. So that everybody is on a level playing field, everybody understands the risks and constraints. And for private sector, a lot of times they don't have the ability or the wherewithal to go do deep dives and diagnostics, right? Because they have a shorter time window. From where you sit at the GEF, can you talk about how private sector can be more transformational, and what's the role of GEF in doing that?
Thanks. And thanks, Warren, for pointing out, to the green and the recent rhino bond. And I think one of the things we're looking at from an evaluation perspective is on the scalability of the rhino bond and the applicability to probably other countries as well as other animals, probably, right? A different context. Nathan, yes. And in fact, our work on transformational change as well as on scaling up pointed out to, all the transformative projects actually had very good policy and regulatory reform as part of the projects. We haven't found transformative projects that haven't had that component as being a critical element of the project. I think Jeff has, and our evidence on recently, we did some work on innovation. We've completed another study, and we found that the private sector in the Jeff has been a major source of innovative ideas, as well as have contributed to higher value added and transformational change within the Jeff context. However, I think there's still a need for understanding what the private sector is about. And part of this is also about the Jeff's role in explaining to governments how the private sector could actually play a good role. Another area is a challenging role is to find out good bankable projects in biodiversity and others. Now in climate change, Jeff was quite instrumental in generating the blended finance instrument through the Earth Fund with the IFC, and that's been pretty mainstreamed. In fact, IFC has come back and said, so can we think of something for biodiversity? So now the Rhino bond, we've done blue bonds as well. But what else, what other instruments are possible? And that's what we're testing now through the non-grant instrument. So bankable projects is a challenge, particularly in biodiversity. One area I think, and after that, I know I'm running out of time, but I think, we talk about the private sector like it's this homogenous theme in running through countries, right? And set of players. And one thing we alerted the Jeff to is don't only think about these large players, multinationals, in whether it's in commodity supply chains or in other areas. It's the MSME sector that dominates the landscape of the countries we work in. And trying to get them to shift their behaviors, trying to help them invest in new energy efficiency investments, it's not easy. So let's not ignore this big sector in countries that needs more of the level playing field if you've got to actually mainstream climate finance in these countries, right? So I think this has been sort of ignored by the Jeff, and now the new private sector engagement strategy has highlighted, based on our evaluation, the importance of how do you integrate the MSME sector into all the work that the Jeff is doing? I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Geeta. A lot of really good, important points there. Now over to you, Archi, the GCF perspective. I know you have a lot of experience on the private sector side. Given that you're a trust fund, and it's important so as to grease the wheels as needed to encourage private sector in many instances. And you guys also have a lot of community engagement, and which is important to understand the local situation for private sector. So what are some of the perspectives from your side to bring about transformational change through the private sector?
Thanks, Nathan. We, in fact, finished an evaluation of the private sector portfolio of the GCF last year. And that picks up from where Geeta just stopped, which is that the mandate of the GCF actually provides for engagement with MSMEs and local actors. So not just MSMEs actually, but also, a fruit seller on the side of the road in a small island. How do you build their resilience against climate risks? So we were finding a couple of things. One was that there was no distinction in the GCF on the what is the project, is the private sector portfolio. The GCF was not very clear. Is it the private sector facility alone versus the public sector projects? Or is it the instruments or grants versus non-grants? Is it just the type of entities that determine what a private sector project is? Or is it just beneficiaries? And that's not clear. And that's related to a fundamental reason, which is that, and I'll come to that in a second, but we're recommending in our evaluation that the GCF has two choices. On the one hand, it could be a high leverage institution that could focus on co-investments. But on the other, it could be a catalytic institution where it can take high risks and risks it's mandated to take, and then catalyze change in new and emerging markets, in SIDS and LDCs, in high-risk economies and geographies where private sector would otherwise not go. And the GCF has the capacity and the scale and the mandate to do it. It has a far higher risk appetite than it's not even a bank, so it can take some of those risks, and it should. And that's the recommendation we were making that even for Paris alignment, and particularly 2.1c, where economies have to align with the private sector and all economic transactions have to align with climate objectives, we're asking for the Gcip to consider using a diverse range of financial instruments and to take those risks. Some projects could look like a grant project to a public sector entity, but that could yield then a enabling environment, a policy change that creates conducive environment for private sector action. And that's the recommendation we were making to the board, to the GCF, that focus to shift not just from the immediate outcomes that are related to private sector, but also to drive that fundamental policy change. And that's where the advantage or clear benefit of an organization such as GCF would lie. That's the recommendation we're making to the board in that valuation.
Excellent, Archi. Thank you so much for linking it back to your recent evaluation. And as part of this panel, we can even provide a link to that evaluation so that the participants here can go view that evaluation for more details. Now let's move to the Q&A session. And I see here in the chat box a number of interesting questions have come up already. So we only have about 10 minutes for this. Now, let me start with this one important question that is addressed to all panelists. So maybe I'll throw it out there. And so it's related to what I was talking about earlier, which is the current geopolitical situation and the implications of COVID, right? And what has happened in the last year and a half. There's been serious setbacks to perception of ESG generally, and there is a lot of pushback in terms of ESG investing itself. So in fact, I would even claim there has been some lost ground in terms of progress that was made on the ESG side. The question here is asking, what are the implications of the recent events on, for example, the pushback on ESG, and also on the global commitments with regard to climate, the NDCs, right? Are the governments not going to be able to do it in a post-COVID scenario? Do they have to go revisit this? And what, to achieve a truly transformational change? And in addition, what the question is also referring to the expected impact of the decision by the US administration recently in putting out certain policy measures there that would promote electric vehicles and new climate, clean energy investments. So let me throw that question, maybe throw it to you, Warren, first, and then we can go around.
Thanks. At the end of the day, the climate change agenda has made, at best, incremental progress because it's a political issue. And the politics go back and forth. And we've all seen this over I've been going to COPs for a long, long time. And to me, it's very disappointing and somewhat makes me somewhat of a pessimist on this, because it is a political issue, and the reactions of different political decisions are global in nature from some of the countries. On the other hand, the good news is that an MDB and to a certain extent the GCF are sort of above that political agenda. We're longer term. We're in it for the long term with our developing country partners, and generally we can, if we're smart in how we program and implement the climate actions that need to be implemented, I think we can overcome the to's and fro's of the political dialogue. And I think we have to stay outside of that. Obviously, the work we do contributes to the knowledge behind the various negotiations that go on every year. But really, we need to focus on the longer term. And I think if we do that, then we can kind of smooth out the bumps and that result from the politics behind the climate negotiations. So I'm not sure if that answers the question, but I think that just very quickly, the decision the U.S. just took was fantastic. It really helps us. But 2 years from now, that could be undone, and we've seen that happen. So we need to grab these opportunities as quickly as we can and build on them, and then say, thank you very much, we're going to move on. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, no, thank you, Warren. Really good point there, right? Having ownership and continuity in terms of prioritizing climate action from an MDB point of view, absolutely critical. And in fact, I would extend it to say any official financing point of view would be absolutely critical. I think that would be a constant force in the market because climate has to be addressed after all, independent of what goes on the policy side. So I think that's a really important point to ensure transformation. Archi, it's the same question to you, maybe your perspectives on this.
Thanks, Nathan. I think it's an important question to ask, but like Warren said, I would also make the argument that we're somewhat insulated from the goings on of geopolitics year to year. Perhaps it manifests in the bilateral engagement of the bilateral partners, and I don't know enough about that. But for the multilateral actors, and all of us on the panel are with institutions that are multilateral, we tend to be somewhat insulated from the geopolitics day to day. Perhaps also because a lot of us are replenished in less than a year-long cycle, in more than a year-long cycle. Our programs of strategies are determined in far longer terms, so they tend to be slightly insulated. Also, because at least for the GCF, the approvals tend to be so long that if they were affected by short-term geopolitical change, that would be quite challenging. So that's one thing. But the other thing is also that we're asking ourselves related to that is for instance energy. And one could make the argument that the transformational change in the energy sector is already happening, at least in many geographies. Should then public finance such as the GCF actually should that be a priority for an institution such as the GCF in areas where there is evidence of change already on its way?
Good point, Archie. Really good point there, right? That the actions of the official partners need to be independent, almost, right, and separate. But on the energy side, it's getting a little bit complicated. On the generation side, solar and wind have become cost competitive, but unfortunately, you see the geopolitical situation now in Europe. There is a lot of regression that's happening. People are going back to coal. So I think the integration and the transition is still a huge challenge, and I think the policy side and the incentive mechanisms there are also a challenge. I think, yeah. Geeta, I think there are specific questions here for you. Let me combine two questions together for you, right? The first question is, in your presentation, Geeta, you talked about the need to include external factors in the evaluation wisely, right? So as to be able to capture transformation effects. The question is asking what is too much, how much of external factors should be captured. If you go too wide, it becomes too complicated, right? That's one. The second question that was mentioned separately there is, when you talk about transformation, are you thinking of like a minimum threshold that every intervention should have, and how do you go about looking at
it? So I think when it comes to external factors, I think at a minimum relevant country context. So when we did the evaluation of GEF interventions in fragile and conflict-affected states and situations, we were quite surprised that at project design, relevant country context and challenges and risks, etc., and actions to mitigate risks were not clearly articulated. And so how do you learn and adapt to situations if you're not even well cognizant or have not recognized that at the outset? So I think that at a minimum, it's that as well as the policy context. I don't recall the second question.
Well, the second question was, when you talk about transformation, is there a minimum threshold?
Minimum threshold. So here again, I think not every project, like Garrett was mentioning, what's the appropriate number being transformative? And I think there are so many elements required in place for something to be transformative that I don't think it's wise for people to plan for every project to be transformational, right? Because there's an element of risk, there's an element of innovation, and every project can't accommodate it. And there's certain bread and butter projects we need to do regardless. So I think there has to be, and this boils down to a discussion at the GEF Council, which is, I think most development institutions have between 70 to 80% of projects which are successful, right? And some people ask, is that too little? Is that too high? And I think that's still too high. There's probably not enough risk-taking happening if you're at an 80% success rate on your projects. So I think defining the innovative, the high risk, and the likely transformational projects with good ambition at the outset is what we need. So it's not a minimum threshold, but at least some articulation, maybe 5% or 10% of the portfolio, right? And I just wanted to come to Warren's point about, looking at the long-term trends. And this is something we've tried to educate the GEF Council on, which is, funding for 4 years is too limited. If you have a long-term mindset, you've got to plan for the long term. And I think the shift towards programs is a step in that direction. I'm a little more optimistic about, and as Warren said, you take advantage of the current situation. And I think Jeff did it with Carlos Manuel, the new CEO. We went in for a really ambitious replenishment and we did get it, all right? We went for a 25% increase. And it was an increase all around in programming and the need for evaluation to generate evidence. So it was pretty promising. And I think historically looking at it, from where I sit with long data timelines, I think Jeff sort of fulfilled its mandate of getting the multilaterals to mainstream climate finance. And today, that's the GEF finance has been well leveraged. This is now mainstreamed in institutions. So I think the GEF is shifting its priorities towards other challenges, environmental areas that have their links to climate, such as chemicals, land degradation, deforestation, etc. Thank you. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Geeta. I think we have reached the end of the time limit for the panel. So I'm not going to take a lot of time to summarize what has been said. It has been very, very rich, great perspectives from preeminent experts in terms of transformational climate action. And we had various topics that we discussed: the role of private sector, evidence, knowledge gaps, some of the challenges, constraints that each of these institutions are facing in addressing climate action in general and then transformative climate action in specific. So two things that for me personally, I got from this is one, this is very difficult and the policy action cannot be always counted on. And it's for the long game. And I think climate action has to be played for the long game. That's one. And so ownership and commitment and having a strategic approach at the corporate level so as to be aligned with that, playing the long game is absolutely critical. The second point that I got is all players, we need a holistic approach, not only within the corporate and all the MDBs, involvement of the policy, capacity, and investment side, but also the country level. It is cross-sectoral, cuts across various themes, involves various communities. And I think it involves a wholesome approach, and partnership and coordination is absolutely critical. And that's why I was trying to engage the panelists to try and see how we can all complement each other and come together in terms of providing a better solution. And I think that is going to be absolutely critical and going forward. And we are all, hopefully with transformational solutions and new technology, solve this problem. With that, let me close this panel. Thank you so much and have a good evening, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.